Hello. I think we've begun here. I'm Randy Horton, Chief Solutions Officer at Orthogonal. Thank you all for joining us today for this webinar. We are pretty enthused about the topic, and our panelists here will introduce themselves in a bit. Many of you may have been to one of our webinars before, but we try and do one about once a month on a topic that we are hearing from people in the industry has a lot of pain, generally related to something related to software as a medical device, accelerating medical device development. Very briefly about orthogonal, we're in the business of improving patient outcomes faster. The way we do it is by working with companies building connected medical device software to help them accelerate their device development. So mobile apps, cloud backend, Bluetooth controllers, AI ML integration into devices. And the way we accelerate is by taking the best of modern software engineering and product management tools and techniques and fusing them with MedTech's focus on safety and effectiveness in a way that doesn't just accelerate device development, but actually raises the bar on safety and effectiveness along the way. So we've got a bunch of questions from all of you. We will just two quick notes here. We will start now. We've promised you all this sort of core content on the topic between now and about 12:50 p.m. Eastern, so 50 minutes. But we will stay on with additional questions for a while longer if you have questions. And frequently, the question sets seem to run longer. So feel free to stick around if we haven't gotten to your questions by the end of that time. And also, if we reach out to you after the panel for feedback on this panel or suggestions on new ones, please reply. Really, it's the way we try to continue to bring you great webinars and sort of continually improve the quality and content of our webinars. So with all of that, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves. Carl, maybe you could start and introduce yourself, and then we'll do Ashley and Bernhard.
Absolutely. Thank you, Randy. Carl Washburn. I'm the Director of Digital Quality, which oversees the SaMD and SIMD quality management systems at Lilly. I've been with Lilly for 10 years, and before that I was with Johnson & Johnson. Randy, these opportunities are welcome and a rare opportunity for us to collaborate across the industry to share ideas, brainstorm, and come up with innovations for problems that we all face every day. Ashley, it's a pleasure being on the panel with you and Bernhard, and thank you for the opportunity.
Very good. Ashley.
Yeah, thank you, Carl. Thank you, Randy. I'm Ashley Miller. I'm the Director of Regulatory Affairs at Hologic, overseeing the AI and connected health franchise there. I've only been at Hologic for about 3 weeks now, so still getting my feet wet here, but I was previously at Digital Diagnostics, where I was the Senior Director of Regulatory, overseeing their software device. Digital Diagnostics developed the first ever cleared autonomous AI, which was indicated to detect diabetic retinopathy based on a fundus image. So I'm excited to share some of my experience working in software, particularly in the AI space, and excited to be here with Carl, Bernhard, and Randy.
All right. Bernhard.
I'm Bernhard Kappe, CEO of Orthogonal, longtime listener, longtime contributor. I've been in software development for somewhere around not quite 30 years or so. And used to work for Microsoft, and in the early days of Agile and various things where we started doing work with web applications and then mobile. And somewhere along the way, I tripped into the medical device industry, and a lot of the best practices and things that we were doing outside of medical device, like agile development, were kind of, no, we can't do that, et cetera. There was a lot of resistance to those things that was initially shocking to me. And then, there were all of the things that came up, like quality management system. What's that? Tools validation. Why do we need to do tools validation? All kinds of things that were very much two different languages and different ways of thinking about the world. And I kind of made it my mission to sort of understand what the spirit of the law was on the one hand, and what we could do on the other side with modern best practices that are really there to make things better, faster, and all of the things that we can do with that, and how can we bring those two things together. And have worked with Carl before, and we have a lot of people in our ecosystem who have really been on this journey to how do we get the best of both worlds. So excited about this webinar and looking forward to digging in.
Great, thanks. So I was thinking I could kind of reread the topic or describe a little bit of, what happens if you're a hardware-based device R&D organization, you're moving to software. But instead, I had an AI tool that wrote a jingle for us. I did this at our last webinar. It goes, I will not play the whole thing now, but I will play it at the end. But it goes to show you both how much AI can do and how truly atrocious it is still right now. I'm going to nominate this song for the old NPR show, The Annoying Music Hour. So hopefully you can hear this, but we'll play just a little bit of it.
Shoo-bop-doo-wop, we're here today. Ashley, Carl, Bernhard, Randy on display. Shifting gears in a whole new way. From hardware to software, we pave the way. Oh, the board's got wires, but code is the king. Where the challenges arise, we make it swing. Hardware to soft, we take on the dance. Finding the beat when we take our chance. SaMD strategy, we're in the groove.
All right. Well, I won't subject you anymore now, but if you want to be subjected to the full thing, we will play it. But yes, to the topic of as you're shifting from hardware to software, maybe not exclusively, you're not necessarily dumping your hardware, but you're adding software into your capabilities. We're going to talk about the delta today. We'll start with a question for Carl. Can you talk a little bit about high level? How do you look at the similarities and differences between sort of hardware products and software as a medical device? And when I say software as a medical device, when we're using it in the context of this webinar, we are not using the formal IMDRF definition, which means there's literally no hardware in the device. It's more sort of, as one of our colleagues calls it, software off the medical device. Oh, wow.
There you go.
Quotes. They gave me some confetti instead. So, Carl, could you talk a little bit about what happens when you start putting software off your medical device that's still part of the device?
Yeah, thank you for the intro song. That was unexpected. That was really cute. With AI, I think all of our jobs are going to be enhanced or done by AI at some point in the future. But thank you for the question. What makes SaMD, software as a medical device, similar or different from physical devices? Some of the similarities are both require design control, which requires design inputs, design outputs, verification, validation, requirements, testing, trace matrix, good documentation practices, etc. Both must comply with ISO 14971, application of risk management to medical devices. So you need to look at your software and do risk assessments in a similar way you do it for hardware. Both must be validated through human factors assessments. And the differences are, let's see, are you still there? Thank you. The screen went off. Differences are, SaMD must also comply with cybersecurity requirements. Looking at a standard such as ISO 27001, information security management. Doesn't apply much to just hardware, but it certainly does to software. SaMD must should comply with IEC 62304, medical device software lifecycle processes. Tremendous guide for developing software as a medical device. SaMD change control must be more agile to immediately respond to issues. If you have a hardware-based project, you can do changes in weeks or months. But for software, you have to have a change control process so agile that you can make changes literally in a matter of hours if needed. And so you have to put in all of the procedural guidance to allow that to occur. And then something very interesting, software as a medical device. With a hardware, you've got a label or instructions for use. But with software, you can end up having hundreds of screens. And you look at those screens to see who they must need to be approved by. And all of a sudden, everybody wants to provide their approval, stamp of approval on every single screen, which could include regulatory, global patient safety, product management, marketing, and also the software development team. And so trying to coordinate that can turn into just an incredible task to make sure that any change has the proper approvals and gets put in and documented as a source of truth. SaMD can operate on a cloud computing platform that may not be classified as a medical device. So you have to look at what portion of your project is classified as a medical device and what portion of the platform can be not classified as a medical device, and how do they interoperate together. I think we'll start with that. I'd love to hear Ashley's and Bernhard's thoughts.
Ashley, so maybe you can add to that is, Carl delineated some of the differences, and there's really some interesting aspects to this. It's not just, well, I'm just going to add X. There's things that go into it. And one of the things you had mentioned in our prior conversation was that people underestimate the impact on the human factors work that has to be done as an example of kind of how things are not just more, but different when you add in SaMD.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people realize or appreciate how much user error could impact software as a medical device. You think as software, it's not directly contacting the patient or the user, so you just make something that works from end to end. But you have to consider, what if the user presses the wrong button? What happens if the user doesn't see the outcome that they're hoping? How do you mitigate that sort of risk? So human factors plays a huge role in software as a medical device, and there are several critical tasks that could be identified through use error analysis when you're planning for medical device or software as a medical device development. And I think another common misconception is that if you test the software in a clinical environment or a bench testing environment and you see success, all of your tests pass, that automatically means that the device is usable, which is not necessarily the case. When you're testing something in a clinical environment, for example, you're just trying to make sure that the device is safe and effective such that it provides the correct sort of outputs, but it doesn't dig into what happens if, like I said, the user presses the wrong button or they get to this screen. So you have to really assess every sort of outcome of the software as a medical device when you're assessing for human factors. And that can even go beyond assessing the instructions for use in every single screen too. A lot of things you have to consider is like the delivery of the instructions for use. If you're giving somebody just electronic instructions for use, or as we see in a lot of non-medical device spaces right now, like a QR code that says access here for the user manual and all these different disclaimers and whatnot, you have to make sure that the QR code works, but also that users are actually accessing the QR code and the user manual as needed, and that it's visible on whatever device they're using. So there are a lot of different nuances here that could impact the risk profile of the device that need to be considered when you're planning for launch in terms of human factors.
Thanks for that. Bernhard, just to kind of round out this sort of the different topics we'll cover today, I heard a rumor that medical device R&D organizations are actually composed of human beings, and therefore there's a human element involved in change. It's a rumor, so you can either verify or just
right now, at least humans are involved. I don't know, based on your AI manufacturer Diddy, I'm not sure whether that's always going to be the case
So far, I
or
think
as
humans are
much.
just
Right?
fine based on that ditty. Let me be clear. That is not quality music.
There you go. There you go. So yeah, I think we'll get into sort of the kind of human element of this, but I'll say this, right? The SAMD to some extent is the the nose of the camel in the tent, the camel being the world of software, right? And if we think about what that world is like and what it means when you're getting into this, it's very different, right? um you are software right now is not what software was, say, 30, 40 years ago. Typically we are talking about an ecosystem where you've got cloud computing, third-party services, mobile apps, web apps, connected devices, devices connected with other devices through software and connectivity, or through the cloud. We've got AI algorithms. We've got all of these things that are happening, some of which outside of the medical device world, hey, it's all one, all of these things are changing and getting updated and sometimes failing and sometimes not, but it seems to work, right? Inside the medical device space, just because we're saying we have SAMD does not mean there isn't all of this other stuff. So that SAMD is connected to things that are not SAMD, that are not device functionality. They're on top of platforms that are changing. Cloud computing, what's underlying that is changing every single day, thousands and thousands of times. Mobile apps on top of BYOD platforms, whatever iOS version or Android version on whatever hardware you have. All of those things are changing and they're all connected in the real world. So the nose of the camel is now you are in, once you get into SAMD, typically you're doing things that are on top of that, and you have to live in that world as well as in the medical device world. So you have to figure out how do you deal with that change very quickly. That is difficult if you are not used to managing change. That cascades all the way through your initial development process, but your maintenance process. Cybersecurity becomes a big, a big undertaking as part of that, and you need to have other processes and probably things that are different in your quality management system, and your, how you do support and maintenance as well, right? So I think that's kind of the fundamental thing that we're dealing with. The regulations, the standards, the guidance are all things that are there to help us deal with some of that, but it is a big undertaking. I can tell you that when you move from being purely hardware to having, let's say, a mobile app and cloud backend that goes with that, now there is software maintenance and operational support that looks different. In some ways it's harder, but in some ways now suddenly you have all of this other information because you have software that's connected to everything. So it's both, oh, how are we going to deal with this, and oh my god, this is exciting, we can actually do so much more with this, use software, use the data, use everything that is possible when you build larger ecosystems to actually make a difference faster. So I think
Yeah, let
that's
me
the situation we're in.
add to your point, Bernhard. I think that's where it becomes most interesting, is that the camel's nose under the tent leads to this new world of integration, interoperability with things that are not SAMD. And the question is, how do you make all those pieces work well together and not have any unexpected surprises in the meantime? One example, connected devices can blur the lines of responsibility for managing risk. For example, a risk from using a connected blood glucose meter may have to be mitigated through showing the user a warning or an error message on the mobile application. And so you have to have these integrated risk management processes for whatever the solution is. So you have to establish rules for managing risks, detecting risks, and mitigating risks across all components and participants in the ecosystem. You can't just have each player say, here's my stovepipe, here's my stovepipe, here's my stovepipe, and hopefully they'll all work together. No, you need to have a larger perspective, and you have to at least have a system of systems, either development plan or approach to making all of these interoperable systems interoperate correctly. And so you have to do things such as end-to-end testing, which brings all the pieces together. You have to have end-to-end risk management for those risks that are transferred across the components from one system or another. And then you have to have system level validation. And so I think those are some of the complexities where no one ever imagined how complex this could be with that little innocent nose underneath the tent. And all of a sudden it seems like you end up biting up more than what you thought. And so it requires a new approach. What are your thoughts on some of those comments, Bernhard?
Spot on. That I think that's definitely those are key parts of it. I'd say there are some things I know you have done around this at Lilly, as you have built out ecosystems there in terms of thinking about interface controls and failure mode analysis at the interface level and residual risk that allow you to compose and more easily have multiple teams and projects working and reusing things within the system. That is something that kind of marries good modular design principles, software design principles with the concepts of interoperability and software segregation, et cetera. I think those are some things tools for making it easier to at a baseline manage that type of thing. Ashley, I wonder how you have kind of dealt with that intersection between the wild world of software and the medical device world.
Yeah, it's been interesting. So I've worked with software on a medical device, software as a medical device, et cetera. And like you said, it's a very, very complex world. And something, Carl, you had said resonated with me about developing all the different components in one ecosystem and the importance of system level testing, especially when you're using non-medical device products as part of your system or your ecosystem here. And we started to talk a little bit about cybersecurity being a software specific requirement here. But what I find interesting is that as regulators and people are starting to become more understanding of the software environment and cybersecurity environment, they're really starting to dig into like supplier management of some of those non-medical device systems here. So when you submit a 510K PMA submission and say, oh, we utilize AWS or this other cloud service, and they're responsible for cybersecurity, that's no longer being accepted. They want to see your supplier agreements and outline the requirements that you have for your cloud supplier and other non-medical device suppliers. And beyond that, if something were to go wrong where those suppliers aren't meeting their requirements, how is your device mitigating any further risk of additional penetration and other things that could happen if something were to go wrong from the non-medical device side. And it gets complicated too when you're using a PC or a mobile app. It's the same thing, especially like you had mentioned, Bernhard, that these devices are constantly updating. How are you designing your device such that it continues to work with minor updates implemented by those suppliers or bug fixes, for example, or at the very least, how are you monitoring the device for failure to work with some of these versions or these new updates from these other devices? So I guess all in all, supplier management is becoming a big hot button topic in terms of the entire ecosystem here for software as a medical device.
Let me
Actually,
ask a-
good.
let me ask a provocatively stupid question here. So does this mean that just the way you deal with this is you have your traditional hardware team who does sort of everything related to the hardware? You have a traditional software team who does everything in the software, and then you overlay a third team, which is just sort of the system of system team, and you just have three teams running with everything?
I guess it depends on how big your organization is. It's certainly one way to do it, but a common understanding of both the hardware and the software on your software development teams is certainly helpful. I don't think anybody has ever seen 100% success when you have teams working in a vacuum between hardware, software, and then the overall end-to-end system. So if you were to take that approach, you could have somebody designing the hardware, and then you have a team designing the software, and they could work by themselves. And then you have that stopgap at the end of that system level team testing everything from end to end. But if you had those first two teams, the software and the hardware team, working together, integrating, understanding, then you could probably mitigate having to do some additional testing on the back end if and when your validation, that your end-to-end system level validation fails.
I would say the other thing to think about is kind of where are you on the, maturity level as a company and product or suite of products, right? If you're a startup and you have, a particular kind of clinical thing that you are showing improving with a device or a sensor or something like that, right? Likely you've gotten a certain amount of money to get to a milestone to prove something. Very often in those cases, digital is a sort of somewhat of an afterthought. There is software, it's on the device, and you're just trying to get that. And then later on, when you think about, oh, now people actually need to use this in the real world, oh, wouldn't it be nice to have a mobile app as a controller for this and to get data off and all of that? Sometimes you either have the sort of, you have more money to go there and you need to do that, and so you have that digital vision already in place, right? If you're a large company, some of them have been in software already for a very long period of time, and have built out digital solutions for a while, where maybe the issue is, well, we kind of did a sort of hardware old school quality management system in a way of architecting and designing the systems, and it's getting long in the tooth, and we need to be cloud native. We need to do those things that allow us to move and innovate faster. These are all different places that people are in terms of that. But I think the kind of the so understand where you're at and what your next goal is. I think the other thing, though, if you are really, coming from a traditional hardware, and without a whole lot of exposure to what software is doing to the world and changing the world, it's not just let's add some software to this. There's a lot of potential to kind of rethink business models and what something may do, what you could look like as a company, rather than potentially selling hardware, and razor blades kind of thing. You could think about the data. You could think about end-to-end patient outcomes and how you can use data and software throughout the entire patient journey or user journey, or disease progression, or what have you, or just product life cycle, to make improvements to patient outcomes. That may mean, oh, we're becoming a service company as opposed to a device company. We are seeing that, and that is in some ways a way of creating and capturing more value. Or even if you are a device company, just being able to capture all of this data that you can use throughout the process, whether that's for for better sales, for better capture of outcome data, or better customer service. All of these things are enabled by having an ecosystem. And so that's why you do this, because if all we talk about is, boy, this is hard, this is difficult, this is different, why would you do it in the first place? Well, the same reason anyone else has gone into software, the same reason why software is eating the world and every company has to become a software company is the same reason it has to happen here.
Yeah, Randy, I think you asked such an interesting question because that's really where the rubber meets the road. And so if you look at, hey, how are you going to pull this off? If you take a system of systems approach, so you have another team on top of the hardware team, on top of the software team to manage the systems interoperability portions of these of the solution. I look at whatever a team's responsibility is should be defined in a development plan. And so if you look at it, there's actually more than one way to skin a cat. Yes, there can be a system of systems development plan with a systems engineering team, and it's their role to manage the interoperability aspects, take the applicable requirements into the subplans for the hardware system and the software system. Another approach is you can say, hey, here's two teams. You have to have a kind of a systemic perspective of what the overarching solution is. And you can either have two teams who equally split that up, or the hardware team or the software team that says, okay, we'll play the lead and we will assume the responsibilities of the integrated system of systems and put those into our plans, and we'll work well with the other partners who are playing into this. And so I think that the wrong way to do it is you have a hardware team develop their hardware device, the software team develop their software device, and assume they're going to work well together without anyone carefully considering what are the systemic requirements, what are the systemic level testing that needs to be done, and the interoperability that needs to be done. Who is responsible for that? And those are all ultimately defined in development plans. And so I think that gets back to, where are your development plans defining these responsibilities? If they're not defining them, well, we have a problem. They're not going to get developed. And so I think that's why I appreciate your question is, how do you best do it? I think there's different approaches. Bernhard, what are your thoughts on the different approaches to a systems approach to hardware and software being combined?
Yeah, I think there have been and there are complex medical devices, and certainly we are now starting to deal with more complexity as we think of it as a device as part of an ecosystem with other devices and software, etc. It's a problem that's kind of been dealt with and solved in other industries where we have more complex devices, automotive,
Yep.
aerospace in particular, right? And there are some things there that I think we have borrowed and we can borrow, right? In terms of, um, being careful how you specify interfaces and contracts really between different subsystems, right? And again, that is one thing that is regardless of how you manage it, that if that's part of the process, both how you define those, what those contracts look like, and then how you prioritize those interfaces in your overall development roadmap, right? That's one of the things where I see, you know, where there can be lots of problems. And so it is much better to prioritize those risky areas early and figure out how do you test and simulate and those types of things early. Um, if you're not used to that, it can be, well, we have all these other things we have to deal with that we think are important, and you end up leaving that integration late in the process. Um, Understandable, but it is the wrong thing to do for a connected system, and you find that out the hard way the first time. And certainly, as you build out a more connected system where there are more changes in there, the more acute that becomes, and the more that has to be part of your, part of your overall process, regardless of whether that's medical device functionality or non-medical device functionality.
One thing I want to quickly add too, because you'd mentioned working in risky environments, is that if you keep everything segregated and separate when you're developing software and hardware, you're really kind of doing yourself a disservice, because you can use software to mitigate hardware risks and vice versa. So if you're working together, it just makes your risk management plan a little bit more cohesive and robust. And you could find out ways to take a risk that may be in yellow down to green, for example, by utilizing some of the software components there.
Yeah,
Yep.
it's interesting. The way you all describe it, it almost sounds like keeping software and hardware segregated like that as teams functionally makes about as much sense as hiring two organizations to build a bridge. One half builds one half the bridge and the other builds the other half, but they'll connect in the middle, right?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's also important to understand where you're at when you're doing this. We've seen this where both in terms of how teams do their work and how kind of quality management, how design controls and governance happens. Um, I have a diagram on this. I don't have it to share now, but maybe we can share it later, which looks at kind of the it's a Venn diagram, shall we say, of medical device practices and quality management and software development practices, right? And I've seen this before where on the one hand, I have a very waterfall, not thinking about change kind of medical device group where everything is very much, we're doing it once and there's not gonna be a whole lot of updates, and not thinking about those types of things and what has to be different within that. And on the other hand, I have what I'd call cowboy agile, where really it's just, hey, we're just gonna go, everything is going to change and work, and there's no real software discipline. I think you find if in those things, if you have those two types of organizations or teams working together, it is not sort of going to double the cost and effort. It's going to like quadruple the cost and timeline for something, because you're really getting the worst of all possible worlds. I think that cowboy agile does not work anyway for building large complex systems. You have to have more disciplined agile. You have to have principles of modularity. You have to have good requirements and testing and things like TDD and BDD, et cetera, and automation to make that work. The same thing on the quality and side of things. There is a place in the middle where you can get, things that move faster and better, as long as you have those disciplined agile practices, disciplined software development practices, and quality, a quality management system and patterns that allow for that. That is the sweet spot where you can be, faster and better than you would be just as a hardware team or just as a software team.
Yeah. Ashley, you said something that really resonated with me when you talked about quality agreements. And you look at some of the issues that we've been discussing. I really think that having quality agreements designed for interoperability to outside vendors, and then you can have internal quality agreements as well to define roles and responsibilities and design for interoperability to bring these complex projects together. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the importance of quality agreements, how you've effectively used quality agreements, and how they enable the successful development of software projects from your perspective.
Yeah, at least external quality agreements, they're becoming more and more scrutinized in terms of who's responsible for what and how it's going to be validated. So you have to really put some thought into the quality agreements and really nail down everything from who's responsible for developing this component to who's responsible for testing the component, who's responsible for testing the end-to-end system, then all the way through post-market surveillance, who's going to be taking in complaints and who's going to field them to the correct manufacturer or supplier, for example. So quality agreements, I know doesn't sound super exciting, but they can be a really powerful tool in terms of mitigating risk and ensuring that your system works from an end-to-end perspective there. In terms of internal quality agreements, you had mentioned the design and development plans, and I think that plan is a great way to really identify which team or which engineer or quality engineer, et cetera, who's responsible for what the acceptance criteria is going to be, what the output's going to be, what constitutes a pass fail, and really taking accountability for your responsibilities in that process. If you build something and it doesn't pass muster through that build phase from IEC 62304, you really have to be accountable for that and show the team that it really needs to, for example, go back and start over from a build from some sort of build phase there. So all in all, I think using these quality agreements to really define responsibilities from defining inputs all the way through testing and post-market surveillance is a really great tool for software manufacturers to take advantage of.
Thank you so much. Very well said. And I think that can really add to making the gears move smoothly without interruption and without any surprises at the end. Just mapping to a good quality agreement. Randy, back to you.
I love this because you all kind of like nailed down the topic. So let me make it more complicated now. I'm going to move the goalpost on you a little bit. We've been talking really about R&D as a function, a multidisciplinary function. What happens when you overlay all the other domains of a medical device company, post-market surveillance, legal, sales, and marketing, and you have all this additional complexity and quality and people who know how to do things a certain way, and all you're adding it in? Could you solve that in 3 minutes or less? No, we can have like that.
I do have a thought about post-market surveillance. It popped in my head earlier when Bernhard was starting to talk about the use of data in terms of collecting user needs, et cetera. If you have a software device or software monitoring device that you are intending to use to inform like product features, figure out how it's actually being used on the market, regulators are going to expect you to use that same data to monitor for post-market surveillance complaints and for things that are going wrong. And that's not just to inform product updates, but it could be to inform when you need to submit like an MDR event to the FDA. So if you have these tools to use data to inform your product development, you have to really make sure you're using these tools to inform your post-market surveillance process as well.
Yep, absolutely. I think that's part of some of the, let's just say, historical resistance that we've seen to collecting data is that, well, if we collect this data and we don't use it, then we might be liable for something, right? If we're not using it. And so I've heard these arguments before, thankfully less and less as we moved into the 2020s, let's say, that I'd rather not know, and let's not collect this data because we aren't capable of managing this. I think in 2025 that really doesn't hold water anymore. That might have been a good argument in 1998, but nowadays it's like, yeah, you can. And the expectations are there that you are collecting data and doing more than just have an 800 line. That's the only way that you collect information on your product. Certainly, whether that is patient risk, but certainly, cybersecurity risk, absolutely that expectation is there that you are actively monitoring your system and dealing with threats. And so it's a type of risk management. Patient risk management is another one. If you can do it for cybersecurity, why can't you do it for patient risk? It's a pretty easy step from one to the other.
Yeah, and just to quickly add on to that, I remember back in the day when EUMDR was first being talked about, there were some global requirements that suggested you might have to do proactive monitoring or reaching out to your customers to collect post-market surveillance data in a proactive way. And a lot of companies were like, how do we do that? I mean, if they don't submit a complaint, how are we going to proactively monitor? And companies at that time were like sending out engagement surveys, for example, to proactively monitor their devices. But now that we live in this connected software world, software could be a tool to proactively monitor and to gather data that way. And I think the
Yeah,
expectation is that they would do that.
yeah. Look, and I think you can see the result of that if you don't go there, right? Ultimately, again, you're in a more complex world with more moving parts, which means more things could potentially go wrong in the ecosystem, right? Despite your best efforts. And if you aren't actually monitoring that stuff, you could end up with, lots and lots of recalls, and things where you don't even know until too late. I know there are, um, my sister-in-law is an electrophysiologist, so does lots of ablations, puts in lots of pacemakers, and different companies on the market have different attitudes towards this, right? I won't name names of companies, but some of them are like, yeah, there are issues, but man, they fix them really quickly before I know that there's an issue. But there are other companies that's like, everyone in the industry knows that there's an issue with this thing, and it takes 2 years for that to get through. Which of those two companies would you rather be? One of those is much more proactive. It is gathering all the data and really leveraging that and has the processes for managing that. The other one does not. Um, I know which one I'd rather be in that particular case. That's the world we live in right now. You can't hide behind things anymore. Things get through very, very quickly.
I
Yeah,
did.
actually, go ahead.
Sorry,
Go ahead, Randy. Actually, you can put monitoring tools within the software to let the manufacturer know if there's a failure, what line of code it failed on, and provide that early detection system. There's certainly data that can be monitored to make sure that the software is working properly. And there's certainly all the mechanisms to reach out for help for monitoring as well. I think that having a robust strategy of multiple systems to let the manufacturer know that there's any software issues or problems. I think that is building that early detection system. Any other thoughts that you have on building an early warning system for proactively monitoring software failures? What are your thoughts?
I mean, obviously it depends on the type of device and the intended use of the device. Like you had mentioned, there's a lot of monitoring software out there that can let the manufacturer know or the hospital system know when something failed and to not use something. Depending on the intended use, again, if you have, say, like some sort of diagnostic device, another proactive way to monitor not just like that it's working correctly, but the effectiveness of the product is to take all that data you're collecting on a day-to-day basis and periodically run checks to make sure that the outputs are as expected, especially coming from an AI space, which I work in right now. If you have devices on the market that have very little clinical oversight, whether they're assistive, autonomous, et cetera, how do you know that the device is actually outputting the correct output there? So I think there will be, as AI devices start to mature and more regulations come out, there's going to be a focus on monitoring effectiveness on the market from that perspective too. How we're going to do that, not quite sure yet. I know other manufacturers have different ideas. So hopefully in the future we get some more guidance on what regulators are looking for.
I think it's a good point. One of the things, Randy, sort of bringing it back to your question of sort of processes outside of purely your R&D organization. Some of this folds into your R&D organization. Uh, but one of the big things shifts is sort of really thinking about data as an asset as opposed to exhaust, right? So I've been in enough companies where we're dealing with the next version of a particular device, and we're saying, well, we could capture this data, we could capture this data, and we could get this off of the device, and et cetera. And R&D engineers on the hardware side is like, why we're not using that, why do we want that? And there's a mindset sometimes of sort of just thinking of the data as exhaust, as opposed to thinking of the data as something of value, right? What we find in a lot of IoT companies that are not necessarily medical device companies, um, they think initially their business is their devices and their connected devices, but it turns out very often they make more money and generate more value out of the data than the devices, right? So there's the attitude of data is valuable. Sometimes data costs money and effort to get, and so you have to think of the economics of that. But and then the other thing you have to think about is how you're going to use that data, sort of data provenance, metadata, if you're going to use that potentially as inputs or as validation, et cetera, for AI algorithms. That is a whole nother process that you have to think about. And then you add to that the fact that do you have permission for this data? Is this data that who owns the data or who has access to the data, who can use this data for what purposes, primary purpose, secondary purpose? All of that is a whole nother set of things that you have to actually think about and deal with. That isn't what an R&D organization is good at, nor a hardware organization. It's almost like you need data and privacy, not just telling you what you can and can't do, but also structuring contracts the right way, and also thinking about that as an asset, as a valuable part of your business. And so that's a big change that I think companies are waking up to. But it's one that is, most folks are still in the early stages of that. And have a whole bunch of historical, well, we never thought about about access to our data, so now we have to pay our customers for the data that we are generating with our own devices.
We're a medical device data company. We happen to have a device to get the data, but we're really about the data, not the device.
Yeah.
So being mindful of time, we got more questions to go, more topics, so we are not done. But I do wanted to say for the people who are dropping off at the end of the hour, thank you for coming. Feel free to reach out to any of us, with questions and follow-ups. We're all online, particularly Orthogonal is always happy to discuss companies facing challenges with accelerating development of software as a medical device. And I do want to actually ask, someone had a very orthogonal question that I really liked. I think would be a fun one for us to do. And then we'll get back to the core stuff. Because then we got a bunch of questions about like, how does this scale down to smaller device organizations, those kinds of things.
I had a question for you, Randy. We're doing another one next month, aren't we?
We are.
Okay. For those people who are going to drop off,
Oh, yes. Thank
when
you.
is that and what's that about?
I'm going to, you know what, I don't have that in front of me, so I'm going to get an answer in 30 seconds when somebody on my team slacks that to me. So
Sounds good.
Perfect.
Sounds good.
Okay. Yeah, somebody asked if their contact information. We will send out contact information afterwards. Probably the easiest way to do it is just send you LinkedIn addresses for people, and then you can message them through there. So the question is, what do we see as the future of SaMD? Um, for, what, I think it's a really interesting question because frequently I think for all of us, one day you turn around and all of a sudden software is doing things that you never even conceived it might do for you. So what do we think we might be seeing as new things that you can do with software in a medical device or more of in the coming years?
I'm happy to answer if as a starting point. Look, I think we are, as with anything, just the there's the things that are already happening in other industries that are maybe happening a little bit more slowly in the medical device industry. So that's the easy kind of forecast. What happened 3 years ago in ride sharing, let's say, or what happened, in some other industry that may be less regulated, and how is that going to happen in the medical device industry? So some of the things we're talking about in terms of thinking about end-to-end processes, harvesting data, and injecting, algorithms or improvements into an end-to-end process. SAMD uh, as part of larger ecosystems and building out those other ecosystems, uh, and maybe putting services on top of those. Those are all kind of things that are logical, natural things that I think will happen, and the opportunities are there. Some things we don't know how reimbursement looks like, what changes are we going to see? We're very much hamstrung by some of how things are reimbursed right now. But if we look at what the UK is doing in terms of reimbursement, looks fairly likely that you're going to get higher reimbursement if you have digital components for certain types of things in the UK. Is that going to cascade through? Is that going to come to America? Is that, who knows, right? Those are all things that are sort of external things that may happen. The wild card is everything that's happening around AI, and in generative AI. We are way behind being able to properly regulate and manage risks around that, right? We're seeing AI already very heavily in things like how you develop software, how you do quality management, and how you do verification and validation. All of those types of things, everything in the process for developing software, absolutely. But how that now gets into devices or into the ecosystem around devices, we're probably going to be way slower in that than in other areas. So it's going to happen, but we're probably, that the gulf between where we are as a medical device industry and what's happening in the rest of the world around general AI is probably going to increase. That's one of the big things I think happens.
Did we just
Yeah,
get that answer
Randy's-
from asking generative AI for the answer? One quick thing before, and then Ashley and Carl on this. Our webinars, as I've been reminded, are always the last Wednesday of every month. So it's May 28th. And the topic is the playbook for running a multi-partner engineering organization, i.e. if you have an internal engineering organization and now you're looking to expand your capacity or capabilities by bringing in an outside organization in addition, how do you make that work? That is our next topic.
Oh,
Fantastic.
Carl,
I just want to add to your point, Bernhard, the future is so exciting. It is just amazing. My phone knows what medications I take. It can read physiological indicators such as blood glucose level if I was wearing a monitor. It knows if I was using a calorie counter, it would know what food I would eat. And it can take that data, which is absolutely gold, and then cross it with artificial intelligence and say, hey, Carl, if you just ran a little bit more, or if you just, change your lifestyle in these very small ways, you can significantly improve your health. That is so exciting because a physician does not have the access to that level of intimate data about me, about what I do day by day. And all of a sudden you can start relying on AI, this is back to Ashley's point, to improve health. And so Ashley, I'll turn it over to you. I'd love to hear your answer to Randy's question as well.
Yeah, I was going to say AI is probably the obvious answer here. But in terms of, Carl, that's a great example you brought up in terms of like the self-management portion of AI that's increasingly becoming less and less regulated because it's giving the patients the responsibility and accountability for their own health. Anywhere from, like you said, the calorie counter thing to being able to use AI to look up like drug interactions. A lot of that stuff is becoming less regulated, as it should be, because this is general information that patients need to have. But in terms of like AI as a medical device or AI in riskier indications or environments, I think the future is looking more towards, say, like a thoughtful AI application here, because there is still a lot of industry and public weariness, I feel like, about AI, especially when it's um, performing the actions that a doctor would typically perform. So I think in the industry and in the public, there is still that desire to have physician oversight into AI applications here. And from what I have heard in the industry and from other manufacturers is that doctors want to embrace AI and they want to use AI to help them streamline their practices, not to replace them, and nor should it replace them, but it should help them see more patients and, like I said, streamline their day-to-day work.
Thank you.
We can keep going on this on this subject. Um, I've got one more here, but it's not necessarily SaMD, but sort of based on what you guys said, right? The non-regulated space, right? We are right now still, what Peter Attia calls medicine 2.0 as opposed to medicine 3.0. Late intervention, um, very expensive, fix things that are already broken. And maybe if we had done earlier detection, earlier prevention, we could have avoided, had better health and better outcomes, et cetera. All that stuff right now, at least, is not, that is earlier, is not regulated, right? And intentionally, the FDA is like, okay, pre-diabetes, no, we're not touching pre-diabetes. We're only touching it once it gets to a certain point. We can make a much bigger impact by preventing more people getting diabetes, et cetera. Earlier detection and earlier action on things is much cheaper. That stuff is all unregulated, and probably we're going to see a lot happening in that space. So that's pretty exciting. It's not necessarily SaMD, but there may be things that come out of that, or there may be a change to you know to how we think about the practice of medicine over the next 5-10 years that may mean either less regulation or more regulation of some of those earlier things. So it'll be a very interesting experiment over the next 5 to 10 years.
Thank you.
Okay, so we loop back to some of the more core questions, as I think we're now reaching our traditional stasis, which is about 40 to 50% of our audience hangs with us for the next 20 minutes or so through the additional questions, and we truly appreciate that and don't take that for granted. You could be doing a lot of things right now, including probably playing Fruit Ninja, unless you're also playing Fruit Ninja right now. So two related questions I'll fuse here, which are really about sort of like, how does all of this change stuff scale up and scale down for different size medical device enterprises? We're not all Eli Lilly size, we're not all Hologic size. Actually, you've been in digital diagnostics, which was not small, but was certainly towards the other end of the scale. And then there was a different question somebody said about centers of excellence, to points a couple of you had made about when do these work well, at what size do they start to work well? I'll throw in what do they do and what don't they do? So
Randy, you have to I have to change rooms. I'll be back in 1 minute. So hang tight, just continue, and I'll be right back with you.
Welcome to the world of large companies where you lose your reservation on the room. So, Ashley, that means you're first.
All right, yeah, interesting question, especially since I've worked for very large companies to smaller companies as well. Um, Overall, the requirements are the requirements, right? Whether you're a very large company or you're a very small company, you still have to develop software in a compliant way. But one way smaller companies can do that without as many resources as a larger company is to make sure that you have like a good training program available. Make sure you say you're hiring software engineers that don't have a lot of experience in the regulated space, making sure that they're getting trained up in what those requirements are so that we develop compliant and thoughtful software from the beginning that meets regulatory requirements. I've also seen a lot of smaller companies utilize consulting firms to help audit some of their documentation or to help test their devices before submitting to regulators because, I mean, submissions are costly and they're very time consuming. So a lot of these smaller companies try to mitigate some of that risk on the front end, especially while they have the funding to do so. So it's just that thoughtful design and development planning that we had talked about earlier is really huge here.
Yeah, I think small companies have challenges, large companies have challenges. I think, it's useful to be, let's say, clear-eyed on what your maturity level is, right? How mature are you as a medical device company? How mature are you as a modern software development organization, as well? And the other part is, how core is software and software ecosystems to your business model and your future, right? Because it's a different answer if it's like, yeah, we need to play in it, and really this is not a differentiator. It's not something where we have to really be strong, in which case maybe the answer is um, uh, just leverage platforms, leverage third parties, etc. I think that is in most cases a very short-sighted answer, but it is one. It comes from the top. How how are you actually thinking about it, and what does it mean? Do you have to uh, be an excellent software development organization, or not, right? And then the other part of it is, are you as are you more of a specification generator that then allows others to build on those things, say the Cisco model, et cetera, if you think about that? Or are you both of those things, or all of those things, right? So I think it is, centers of excellence. I think having somewhere in there a group that knows what they're doing really well and is very good at that, and applying modern methods is very important to have. And ideally, it's something that is working in a particular area that happens to be either you already have to be there in order table stakes, and in diabetes, if you're an insulin pump manufacturer, you're something, CGMs, et cetera, yeah, you've got to be moving fast. Software is and ecosystems are super important. Or you have a group that is, really doing it for the first time, so you could actually set it up right. Um, that means having the right people in as part of that. And that's where one of the big challenges comes, which is, you know, two different languages. The best software development people typically aren't in a medical device company, right? Um, and people with deep medical device software experience maybe don't have the best, most modern practices, right? And they speak different languages. So that is one of the central challenges: is how do you translate between those things? How do you know what good actually is, right? the thing that I see a lot in large companies is there's a lot of maybe something that's learned in one particular area, and it's not distributed well throughout the organization. um it, I've seen this with large groups where, for example, you ask, so I know this group over here, let's say in diabetes, is doing all of these things. Can't you talk to them and understand what they are doing and look at their SOPs and look at all of those things and their lessons learned? Those conversations very often aren't happening, and there isn't a sort of sharing between different groups within an organization. And that, to me, when I first found that in with large medical device companies, I found it somewhat shocking, because even when we didn't have this kind of sort of the kind of connectivity and potential for knowledge sharing that we have now, back in the 90s when I was working at Microsoft and I was working on Excel pivot tables, when we had issues with SQL Server, we had, Windows OS, all those types of things. There was a listserv, and I could just ask questions and I would get answers. And the deeper I went, the more, you would get just real feedback on things. That kind of thing I see very much lacking in a lot of medical device companies. People have knowledge inside the organization, things that have worked, but it's not really well shared. And I would put effort towards, figuring out how you can get that knowledge better distributed in the organization.
The organizations don't know what they know or know where to find what
Yeah,
they know.
that's right. I mean, look, it's a classic knowledge management kind of scenario, but sometimes very simple things can help in terms of that.
So I'll ask one final provocative question, and then I'm going to ask each of you to close with your action items for everybody listening. If you can only do a couple things walking away from here, but the provocative question is this. It'll start with a little vignette. I used to live in Chicago, where Orthogonal's headquartered. Northwestern Memorial Hospital, big health system, a lot of physical plant infrastructure. And I remember a decade ago, they wanted to tear down one of their buildings, which they put up probably in the 60s or 70s, to put up another building, I think for pretty much the same purpose in the exact same spot. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars for new construction. Everybody was a thing because it was a historical building, so they didn't want to let them tear it down. Lesson learned: if you ever want to be able to tear down your building, don't make it historically significant in the first place. Make it really boring and dull. But the interesting part was they said, well, why not just retrofit the old building? And the answer was that would be 2x the cost of tearing it down and putting up a brand new one. That's actually far better. So at a certain point, are you better almost just building a brand new hybrid SaMD hardware organization, as opposed to trying to retrofit your old one? Like, what's the marginal cost here?
That's an interesting question, right? I think there's a whole bunch of things that go into that, right? But I mean, being honest about your maturity and what you have, having an external assessment at some point might make sense for some of those things, right? Certainly, we're involved in that with a number of companies where they've, built things out, and they want to know, okay, where are we? we While we haven't really developed sort of everything that you would want for a mature maturity model, we have the beginnings of that. And that might help you make those decisions to know, you know, where you're at and what the best thing is, right? Culturally can be very difficult to start totally over again. And I've seen it work, and I've also seen it fail. So really depends on where you're at.
Yeah, I typically hate the it depends answer, but it's a regulatory favorite. Um, but you have to be honest about your maturity. If you are, say, company that develops drug libraries and you want to get into like an AI diagnostic space, that's when your maturity level is not at a point where you could just use the same team and pivot. You either need to start over or hire on a totally different team with that expertise. But if you're a company that is developing, say that drug library company, and you just want to pivot into a different infusion space, that's where you might be able to use some of that same knowledge base and same team there, because it's building upon like the same sort of technology.
Yeah, I think
Just
how much track record do you have as well, and what is the data telling you? If you have had really the same core code base for the last 8 years, and every release takes longer and is harder to get out, um, that tells you you're heading in the wrong direction. Something is radically wrong with with both your underlying technologies and probably your processes as well, right? On the other hand, your metrics are moving in the right direction, and one, you have metrics, right? And you're moving in the right direction. That's those. Uh, you can do some analysis based on those types of things that might point in one or more directions for you to go.
Yeah, just to add to Ashley's and Bernhard's point, you have to objectively assess your current capabilities and maturity of your SAMD organization, and then decide, okay, this is where we are. Should we partner with someone else who has a fully mature SAMD development capability, or should we develop it ourselves? And I think that the real pitfall is not realistically estimating how long that maturity takes. Developing a mature SAMD organization, I mean, looking at you, Bernhard, I'm thinking the magnitude of years. You're not just going to say, hey, in 6 months, we're going to have it. No. Between hiring the right people, having the development experience, and learning and evolving and becoming more mature, it's quite a time period. And that's why you would say, well, maybe we should partner on this project and make that build versus buy decision. Right on the right track here, Bernhard. What are your thoughts?
I think that is I think there is again, yes, I think you are. I think there is the build versus buy decision. Part of that is also then again how what capabilities have to end up being core capabilities. How strategic is it for you? I think, so one way of looking at it is there's build, there's buy, and there is a more of an enablement one, where one of the things we do with organizations is, if they know strategically, look, we need to have these capabilities in-house. We know we don't have them, but we also want to build and not sort of take forever to do that, is partner with someone where we're partnering with them as like, here is our organization, here are the best practices and the tooling and everything we've done. We know you're going to build some of this up. Do it together with us, learn and build up your team, and then we can help in terms of evaluating and hiring and all of those things. So, so they get there faster, and at the same time they're delivering value and product. That's the sort of middle way that can work as well, that we've successfully done in with some customers.
Thanks.
All right, so I think we're going to ask the wrap-up question, which should be pretty concise. First of all, thank you to our panelists. This has just been tremendous. You all also get the gold star for doing homework before a panel. I'm just, you saved me so much work. It was great with what you came with at the beginning. So, but if you're an advisor to a company, that's embarking on this journey, give them a couple of action items. Top things they should or shouldn't do as takeaways to get started tomorrow morning. Let's do Bernhard, then Carl, and then we'll have Ashley back clean up.
Yeah, so I'm going to give advice, I would say, to CEO of a major public company who is saying digital and data is our future. This is where we're going. This is what we have to do. Be clear what that means, and whether your organization is really ready for it. I would walk on the shop floor, walk to the R&D group and ask questions about things like data and how they think about that, right? Not to the head of that group, but to someone in your R&D organization, and see how ready they are. There's some simple questions on how they think about things in terms of that. That would be one of the things I would do, and really think about where your company is going to be, you know, in 3, 4, 5 years, assuming that a little bit more slowly than in other industries, the same stuff is going to happen here. So what does it really mean for you to be, you know, digital forward data company, et cetera, et cetera? What does that really mean? And are you investing the right money in the right way to get there? I Some cases it's happening, but a lot of cases I think the companies are kind of falling down on the way.
Good point. One of the things we did when we were developing our SaMD capabilities is we created a statement of applicability where we looked at the IEC 62304 standard, and point by point, we created a trace matrix to every local procedure we had to support the requirements of the standard. Now, yes, the end product was very valuable in two respects. First of all, going through that point by point took a lot of time. We had all the stakeholders involved, hardware, software, SIMD, SAMD, and even our IT organization, and having those discussions and coming to a common understanding of what the standard means to your organization was extremely helpful, just from the educational perspective alone, so that everybody can start talking the same language in terms of what the expected outcome is. Second of all, yeah, when we created it, we had a lot of gaps to fill, but filling those gaps was valuable. And then having the statement of applicability in the case of an audit is tremendously helpful. And so certainly that's one of the best practices that has been tremendously beneficial to our organization. And if you haven't done it, do it. I've seen other organizations that have done it. It's a great practice.
My answer is going to probably be the most regulatory answer you've ever heard. But for companies wanting to develop a SaMD, step one for me is, what are your indications for use? And I don't just mean intended use, what you want the software to do, but what is your patient population? What is your user population? What's your use environment? And once you have all of the aspects of the indications for use defined, start your risk management process right away, because those factors, the indications and the risks, are going to drive and inform your development process from step one all the way through post-market surveillance. So the biggest action item for me is having these things defined up front, because it'll help streamline your development process.
It's funny you say that's the most regulatory answer, but in some ways, I think it's the most business-oriented answer also, because you're just saying, folks, don't build until you know what you're building and why you're building it and who it's for, right? Now
That's like my motto, Randy.
but software makes it so easy to not do that in some ways.
Yes.
It's easy to slip down that hole.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you all for that. It's been terrific, and I am going to close with our the full 1 minute and 51 seconds of our jingle. So thank you to our audience for attending, and hopefully, you'll be able to get the jingle out of your head eventually. The last time when we tried it.
Didn't you have AI just, working in the background to create a new jingle based on this conversation?
So it's interesting. This AI actually gives you very little input. Like, you give it, like, there's 145 characters or something. Like, it was pretty small. You can't actually give it, like, at least this particular tool yet, a full dialogue and say, turn this transcript into a song.
I should have you talk to my brother because he can he do a lot more than that. So
All right.
yes.
All right. I will do that. So anyway, thank you all. We will see you next month. And by the way, somebody did ask a question about what the heck is going on with the FDA and how is this impacting SaMD. We didn't have time to get to it here, but last month's webinar, if you go listen to it with Kwame Elmer, Steve Silverman, and Phil Desjardins, they really nailed this topic. So I would suggest you go back and listen to our webinar from last month or read the summary if you want. And with that, I will play our song here.
Shoo-bop-doo-wop, we're here today. Ashley, Carl, Bernhard, Randy on display. Shifting gears in a whole new way. From hardware to software, we pave the way. Oh, the board's got wires, but code is the king. Where the challenges arise, we make it swing. Hardware to soft, we take on the dance. Finding the beat when we take our chance. SaMD strategy, we're in the groove. Changing the tune, we find our move. Oh, the rhythm's tricky, but we won't stray. We sync to the future the software way. Button to swipe and parse to the
Alright.
cloud. The ascent is steep, but we're standing proud. Debugging dreams, making tools that shine. From physical weight to a digital line. Oh, the tools have shifted and minds must run. We face transition, but the work's not done. From the hard shell box to invisible skill, let's harmonize the future we're building still. SaMD strategy, we're in the groove. Changing the tune, we find our move. Oh, the rhythm's tricky, but we won't stray. We sync to the future the software way.
Mark my words, this is going to win a Grammy for the best AI generated song for a MedTech webinar next year.
Thanks,
Thank you,
guys.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Bye bye.